Hello, welcome to the British Council season of the Best of Young British Novelists. As some of you are aware, we're collaborating with the Granta magazine to bring 20 of the best British UK young writers to India. And we have with us two brilliant writers today, Ned Bowman and Evie Wilde. Evie Wilde has been born and brought up in London, and she spent quite a lot of time with her family in Australia. She's got two books to her credit: After the Fire, A Still Small Voice, and All the Birds Singing. Her first novel got a lot of awards, and interestingly, Evie has also got an independent bookshop in South London. We'll talk about it a little later. Ned Bowman was also born and brought up in London, and he also has two books to his credit. His debut novel, Boxer Beetle, and his second novel, The Teleportation Accident, which was also longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. And the third novel, The Glow, the excerpt of which is in the Granta magazine, will be coming out shortly in 2014. So hi Ned, Evie, welcome to the British Council and to India.
Hello, thanks
Hi,
for having us.
thanks.
So how's it going? I know you've been here for a little while, and Ned, you longer than Evie, so maybe you can tell us something about your experience in India. Is it your first time? How is it going?
Yeah, it's my first time in this part of the world at all, and I've been really enjoying it. My favourite thing so far is eating in Old Delhi. It's amazing.
Evie, have you managed to go out a bit?
I've been walking around quite a lot, which is what I like to do in places I don't know. I've never been to India before, so yeah, it's been lovely. And like Ned says, it's all about the eating.
Oh, lovely, yes. And of course, going back to our focus for literature this year, it is the Granta and the Best of Young British Novelists. We'll have about 10 of the 20 writers actually traveling to India over a period of 7 months to various centers, 9 centers across the country, and also to Nepal and the other South Asian countries. This July, we started with the Granta season with Sanjeev Sahota, your contemporary in the Granta book, traveling to Chandigarh and Delhi. And we, of course, had a good discussion and a good response to Sanjeev's work here as well. So, of course, congratulations for being on the Granta list. How has life changed after that?
Oh, not a huge amount, apart from really wonderful things like being able to travel here and other places in the world. Life sort of carries on as normal for me anyway. I run the bookshop and I try and write as much as possible in between everything else, but yeah, there's not a great deal of pressure, I don't think.
Yeah. Oh, good. Ned, has life changed after the announcement?
No, I'd agree with that. And also, I live in the US where the Granta list is still has some kind of presence, but they have their own lists over there. The New Yorker does one, so being there is probably even less of a kind of permeation of my daily life.
Yeah, okay. Because we had a lot of writers, audience actually writing in and wanting to find out how does it feel to be on the Granta list, because it's so well known, really. But Evie, you mentioned that you got married this July, and all your traveling, has that bothered the married life?
I don't know, I'll see when I get home, but I seem to have been on about 4 honeymoons without him, so I'm perfectly happy.
Okay, right. But talking about Granta, what were your first encounter with the magazine? Do you remember that at all?
I think I was bought a subscription to Granta when I was about 18 for a year, and it always seemed like this incredibly worldly, very serious book of short stories to me, and then so it's quite weird subsequently being on the list and getting to know people like Ned, and turns out we're all human beings.
Yeah. Ned, do you remember your first encounter with Granta?
To be honest, this issue of Granta is the first issue of Granta that I've ever read.
Really?
But I was definitely aware of it, and I was aware of the list of 20, partly because I went to university at Cambridge, which is where it originally started as a student magazine decades ago. So the student magazines they had while I was there, people always sort of hoped that maybe they would turn out like Granta did and turn into an international thing. But I'd never quite roused myself to investigate it seriously until actually becoming directly involved with it.
And what about the writers on the list? I mean, any particular who are your favorites on that list?
Ned Bowman. And also, I was already quite a big fan of Ross Raisin, Sarah Hall. Yeah, there are some really good, interesting writers on there.
Yeah. Ned, how about you, apart from Evie, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd read any of them before the list came out, but actually I've read quite a few since, including Evie's second book, which I really enjoyed. And there are lots that I'm looking forward to reading, like Adam Foole's new novel, sounds like it'll be right up my street, and David Chalet, is that how you say it?
I can never say it.
I don't know how to say it, but I'd heard of him, didn't really know who he was, and then his extract in this is so great, so I'm really looking forward to that book. And oh yeah, Ben Markovitz had written about, I'd read one of his books about Byron, but now he's writing about the present day, so I bet that will be really good.
Oh, okay. And what about the past lists? I mean, any favorites from there? Any influences that you had from the past list writers?
I was always a big fan of Rachel Seifert, who was on the last list, who wrote about Nazi guilt, which is always fun. And you know, as a very young girl, I read Ian McEwan's early stuff, which I used to love.
I love Kazuo Ishiguro and Alan Hollinghurst, and I have quite kind of ambivalent feelings towards Martin Amis's work, but it's still very important and it's a big presence. Yeah, those would be the main ones.
Okay, turning to what I'd said, I'll come back to you, Evie. You have a very envious day job. You work and you own a bookshop.
Yes.
Tell us more about it.
It's a very small independent. We deal mainly in contemporary fiction with a little bit of art and architecture. And it's probably, I don't know, it's just basically one room of books. So everything is hand-picked by me and my business partner, Roz. It's great. It's a lovely place to work. A bit like writing, it's not a way to make a fortune. And it's a bit of a rocky road for bookshops at the minute, but it's a lovely place to work, although I don't just sit around reading, sadly. I'm mainly worrying about how to sell books and how to run events. We run a Peckham Literary Festival every year in November, which is quite stressy.
And do you feature your books in a particular fashion?
What, my own book? The lady that I have hired to do weekends, when she works there, she puts a little sign up about it, but it feels a bit creepy to me.
And I lived in Peckham in about 2008 to 2009, so actually I'd been into the bookshop before, quite a long time before I ever met Evie.
All right, and you met Evie at the bookshop?
No, it was at was it that BBC thing? We were on some other list together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. But you manage time to write? I mean, if you...
Not at the minute, but but when I kind of get into the rhythm of it, I get up early and I work before going to the bookshop.
What about you, Ned? Your mother is a publisher. Did that influence you at all when you were growing up?
Well, she started her publishing company about 12 years ago or something. So by that time I'd already actually made it my ambition to be a writer and felt like I'd embarked on that in some minor way. So the publishing company itself wasn't an influence, but my family being very bookish in general was certainly an influence. So I definitely grew up surrounded by books and with the idea that writing and publishing a book was kind of a realistic thing for a person to set out to do.
And do you think you'll be taking up the publishing house from her?
No, definitely not. I mean, I really admire what she's built, but the sensibility of her list is so different from the kind of thing that I write and read. I would be completely useless.
Yeah.
I mean, I've stuffed envelopes for her before, but that is the absolute top senior level that I can be trusted with in that institution.
Yeah, and that might bring me to the other question. Ned, critics have found it very difficult to put your work in some category. The closest they come probably to is science fiction. And you'd probably in one of your Guardian interviews said something that let me quote that. Until I was 16, I read nothing but science fiction, and I am sure it's found its way permanently into my writing. Do you like that categorization, or do you think that's justified?
Well, I don't think I am science fiction, because even in my second book, The Teleportation Accident, which sounds science fictional from the title, it actually only becomes science fictional at the very end. But I do think, especially in American fiction, there is this movement towards a kind of writing which doesn't really draw a distinction between the two, because we live in such a kind of science fictional world. Everything is so futuristic and overwhelming that, like, even when you're writing the most banal realism, you end up filling it with elements that feel almost science fictional. So I think the only reason I've been hard to categorize is because I'm in the UK rather than America. If I were writing in America, where there's a lot more people who write the kind of thing that I do, I would just be just another one of those, I think. But I'm a slightly rarer breed in the UK.
Yeah. And what about you, Evie? I mean, people try to say you write more historical fiction, or you try to do more family plots. I mean, how do you put that?
I think, I tend to get called literary fiction, which kind of means nothing. But in terms of where you're put in a bookshop means something. I don't really know. It's not really something I think about when I'm writing, and it's not really something that I think you should worry about. I think you write what you write, and if people want to call it whatever they want to call it, then they will, and that's a way of selling the book, really, rather than anything else.
Right. And tell me about, there's some connection that we can still find between your works, is something that you talk about global conflicts. You have talked about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And is that on purpose, or how do you both come up with some kind of historical background in the stories? Is that something that you have had in the background, like in Australia when you were growing up, and not many people knew about the involvement in Korea War or something like that?
Well, for me, it was Vietnam in particular came into the book purely because it seemed to serve the story and the character. My uncle, who's Australian, was conscripted and fought in Vietnam, and so that was really as far as my knowledge of Vietnam went, apart from the popular culture things like Apocalypse Now and that sort of thing. So through writing the book, I became more and more interested in his experience in Vietnam rather than the other way around. And I talked to him a lot about it, and that in turn made me more interested in my own family and relationships.
Right. What about you, Ned? You do refer to historical...
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of conflict, I come from a Jewish background, and European Jewish, so the Holocaust is a presence in my ancestry, but actually not one that I was that aware of growing up, because even though my mum was born after it finished, she still finds it really unpleasant to talk about. So in psychoanalytic terms, it's sort of there in the shadows. But also, I mean, I think my engagement with that period is actually quite superficial. I just like writing about the Second World War and the Nazis because I just like extremes in history. So it's the worst thing that's ever happened, perpetrated by the worst people there have ever been, is just like a useful background, often against which to tell jokes, to be honest, but also against which to like have adventures and so on. So it's quite frivolous, all the historical stuff in my book. Certainly I don't think anyone's learning anything about conflict and its aftermath from my first two books.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, so I think that brings us to the point where we can take questions from live audience. But before we do that, would you want to read a bit from your Granta, some extracts? Ned, would you want to go first?
Okay. How long should we do?
How long do you want to do? 2 paragraphs? Is that enough?
2 paragraphs, sure.
Okay.
Do you want me to hold your mic?
I can. In Granta, I have, in this Granta, if I can find it, I have an excerpt from my forthcoming 3rd novel, Glow, which is coming out in the UK at least in May next year. And most of the book is set in London in 2010, but this is a flashback to Burma in about 2008 about a drug chemist called Win. Mongla was a town on the Chinese border where the United Wa State Army made such extraordinary profits from opium that one year they whimsically used some of the surplus to construct a museum of drug eradication. Win's aunt had sent him to work in Sang's small yabba factory when he was 15 years old. The pay was low and the hours were long and the fumes gave him headaches, but at least he knew it was gangster to be so close to the drugs and so close to the money. Also, he was captivated by the chemistry, the magical logic and odorous grammar of the catalytic reactions, the precursor's ascension to new forms like a soul moving through the 31 planes of existence, the idealistic, asymptotic pursuit of absolute purity. He even loved to watch the last fastidious hesitation of the electronic scales before they settled on a count, the polar shimmer of the crystallized product in the first few seconds after it was sifted out of the evaporator. His boss, Sang, was an obese, mottled Chinese guy with a big appetite for boys. Once or twice a week, Sang would bring Win into the back office, lock the door, and undo his fake designer belt. But Sang had what Win would later come to identify as a rare disability among males. He couldn't seem to turn himself on by the use of force. This left Win with some bargaining power. And quite soon, he asked to be allowed to take some lessons from Sang's chemists and to spend a few hours a week in the internet cafe on the corner, browsing websites like Lotophage. Within 2 years, he was running the factory for Sang, and its output had never been higher. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ned. And as Evie finds her way, I can ask a quick question that we've got online from Ayendrina Mukherjee. And of course, the question is to probably the both of you. She's said a lot of good things about all the awards that you got and stuff. But what you wanted to know is, how do you get the inspiration, really, to write?
Well, most of my books start with 2 different unconnected things that I've read about, either on the internet or in books, but which seem to me to have some kind of resonance between them that isn't immediately clear. And then the plot tends to emerge from trying to work out what those 2 things could have in common and how those 2 things could collide in a person's life. So quite often it will be the case that in the process of researching one book, I'll come across something unrelated, but which will then be one of the 2 elements which kind of come together in some kind of reproductive fusion to make the next book.
Right. Evie, are you ready?
Yeah. So I'm going to read from an extract from my second book, All the Birds Singing. The main character is a woman called Jake, who in this section is living on a sheep shearing station in the desert in Australia. I'll just read a little bit. She's started a relationship with one of the shearers, who's called Greg, and they've been making love, and something has crept in the room, or she thinks something's crept in the room. I'm feeling under the bed for the hammer, but I can't find it. Greg lifts himself off the bed and gives his head a small shake to clear it. He goes lightly over to the switch and turns it on. The strobing strip light does nothing but throw shadows. Like a big dog, I say. The strobe settles, but there are still shadows and places to hide. The workbench is covered by a blue oilcloth that hangs down and hides the space under it. Greg picks up the metal pipe that leans against the wall. I'm glad he's kept his underwear on. I think this would be so much worse if he was naked. I have made his nose bleed, but he ignores it, lets it flow down onto his lip while he holds the pole with both hands like a cricket bat. He treads carefully and slowly towards the workbench, and his eyes dart around, finding new shadows. The hair on the back of my neck prickles. I try not to think of Kelly or picture Otto outside holding a gun and watching. Holding his cutthroat too. He will kill Greg, and then he will do me slowly. Kelly will snap at the air by my face as she watches me die. He will cut off my hand and give it to her as a prize. Kelly is dead, I think, but the thought is not a comfort. I'll leave it there. Cheerful note.
That's actually an appropriate point to leave it, because I've got a question from Purnima from Meerut. Meerut is another city in the north of India. And she has a particular question for you, Evie. And she says, your novels are primarily about loss. Is that deliberate?
I don't know how much is deliberate in any of my writing, to be honest. I think the way that I write is I write for a certain amount of time until I have a certain amount of work, and then I find a story in it, and I kind of follow that and flesh that out. I don't ever set out to examine one particular thing or to tell or to really teach anything or anything like that. I think that naturally loss is something that I must be interested in, but I only know that through writing the books, if you see what I mean. There's a funny stage after finishing a book. I find that you talk to other people who've read it and they kind of tell you what it's about. So it's I'm aware that it's there, but I don't know where it comes from.
Okay, and I have another question from Besaki Thakur. And she's got a long paragraph. Let me read that. It seems interesting. I'm an aspiring author, though I read a lot of English books, but I write in my mother tongue, that is Bengali, because I think in Bengali. You're more aware of the languages now with Assamese on the translation course. What I would like to know from both of you is the journey to creativity. What I exactly mean, is there any premature stage of writing where you think from top to bottom of the novel, every minute details of it, and then start writing? Or you move as the story leads you with your characters?
Well, my plots tend to be very complicated. So I'd say even if I only plot 50% of one of my books before I start, I've still done more plotting than most people do at all, because there's just so much plot in there. So in some ways, I leave a lot of it open, but then in other ways, I do an awful lot of planning. I think it's I find it. I want to know roughly where I'm gonna end up, but you have to leave yourself lots of room on the way, because you discover so many things while you're writing, and you have so many ideas while you're writing. And also, I carry on doing research often while I'm writing, and come up with stuff that way. So I don't know. I've done a bit of screenplay work now, and screenplay work, I think you really do have to have everything planned before you start writing, otherwise it won't work. But novels, I suppose one of the joys of them, actually, in contrast to other forms, is that you can leave lots of it open, and often that's a great boon.
What about you, Evie?
I think each book has been quite different, and I feel like I'm learning every time, kind of different ways, and I think I feel the need to approach each book quite differently. So the first one, I didn't plan a single thing. I just wrote for a certain amount of time and then worked out what I had. The second one, because the structure is a bit complicated, I wrote probably about half of it and just followed a character, and then I had to sort of make a chart and work out where I was going with it. But that's more that I find it very difficult to hold the whole thing in my head at one time. I think that's why, for me, working without any plot at all in mind is quite a calming thing, because I just can't get it all in my head at once. But the one that I'm working on now, I'm starting with a lot of research, so I've never done that before, and I think everyone does it a bit differently.
And that's the last question I'm taking from my sheets, and we have our Readers Club members here. I'll open it to them as well. We have one question. Okay. Okay, let me just get that. Yes. Thank you. So one is, of course, Mitali from Shillong. She wanted to know how much research really goes into your historical, whatever history, when you're quoting from history or using it as a reference, but generally how much research does really go into a novel?
It depends. I find sometimes research can stall you from writing. So with the two things that I had to research with both the books, so Vietnam and with the other one, Sheep, which I know nothing about, I wrote what I thought it might be like, and then I researched afterwards so that I still had that kind of free flow of not finding a fact out that was fascinating and crowbarring it in, and not being led by the research, but being led by the story.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, once you started, I mean, you had Sheep in mind, and then you started research. Did you like that research? Would you have dropped it?
I did everything possible to keep sheep out of the book.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the places that I had the character, it just made total sense that the sheep were in the book.
Okay. Ned, do you have another point of view?
Well, my first two novels, I did lots of research, and I think a lot of the best stuff in them emerged from the research, in the sense that the research inspired some kind of filigree or twist. And then because my third one is set in the present day, I didn't have to do so much. But the one I'm writing now, which is my fourth, it's historical again, but I'm trying to develop this new approach where I want to write something that feels like it's meticulously researched and I haven't actually done anything, because I'm so bored of spending time in libraries. But I also quite like that sense of history spreading out in a kind of robust and reliable way beneath you as you're reading. So I want to be able to fake that sense and sort of manufacture plausible sounding historical factoids and anecdotes, which is actually, it's quite hard work, but it's sort of working, I think, so far.
Yeah, so it is working in libraries like these for long, researching quite a bit, and not just sitting in your room and writing.
Yeah, for these two I spent hours and hours and hours in libraries, yeah.
Okay, so I have another question from Eugene Pinto, 29. I think this one's for you, Evie. What is the one real life incident or encounter that was the inspiration for your novel After the Fire?
Ooh, After the Fire is, it's hard to say one moment, but I guess it sort of grows from my Australian family, and I mentioned my uncle who fought in Vietnam. My grandfather, my uncle, and my uncle's son are three very macho men who are sugarcane farmers, and they drive their tractors in their underpants with a hat on and bare feet always, and yet they and they shoot wild goats, and they are very, and yet they will be in bed for a week in tears if they have to shoot one of their dogs because the dog is ill. So they're an interesting, lovely group of people, but they're unable to communicate softly with each other. Mm-hmm. And that's always interested me, because my father was a very feminine man, and he liked eating and drinking and being very comfortable, and could talk about his feelings quite freely. So it's just the difference between our families, I think.
Yeah. And do people respond to when they read that kind of stuff?
I think so. I was asked in a taxi cab in New York on the way to do an event what my novel was about, and I ended up saying it's a romantic thriller about men who can't talk. And and I think that is, as accurate as I can get.
Yeah. Okay, the next one's for you, Ned. Does your novel Globe use elements of magic realism, or is it another take on science fiction?
I'd say no. It's quite a down-to-earth thriller that's meant to be fairly realistic and rooted in the contemporary world. There is one, I guess, semi-magic realist element in it, which I kind of don't want to say what it is because I want it to be a surprise when it happens in the book. But it involves animals, as magic realism quite often does. Yeah, so there's just, I actually wanted to make that one non-realistic element stand out all the more by having just this one thing and then nothing else. The rest of it, hopefully, is like fairly realistic, if a bit exaggerated.
There's another one for you, Ned. It's from Nitya, and her question is, some people I met were put off by mention of homosexuality in Glow. I was wondering if bringing about social awareness or change was part of your agenda, or was it an essential part of your protagonist?
Yeah, well, so all three of my books have had quite prominent gay characters, and it's actually, in each case, it's been entirely for pragmatic reasons that the plot has demanded that they be gay, either because, in the first one, it was because just like, you know, boxers in the 1930s were all men and scientists were all men, so it had to be a gay couple. In the second one, there was this scene where the main character has to think this other character is gay, but then he turns out to be bisexual, and that's a disaster. And then in the third one, it just had to be that I can't remember, but basically that someone had to not be romantic competition for somebody else, and for that to be the case, they had to be of different sexualities to just rule out the reader thinking, oh, is this going to be a love triangle? So it's not, I mean, as much as I'd like to promote gay rights and sort of sensitivity, it's nothing to do with that. It's just the plot forces it like that.
Right. Thanks so much, Ned. And we can have some questions from the Readers Club here as well. They've been reading your works, your novels and the Granta writing. Do we have some questions? That's okay. We can go ahead with yours first.
This one, Ned, you mentioned you are now living in America, so is Martin Amis. And then we had this declaration by the Man Booker Prize that they are now going international, which is devastating to some. How does it? I mean, how do your American colleagues, writers, respond to that? Is it Man Booker what, or do they know?
Well, I don't know actually, because I haven't been to. Oh no, I've been in New York for 24 hours since that was announced, so I wasn't really able to take a sounding. The Man Booker does get reported in the New York Times and everything, so it already has a profile. But I think people in US writers already have the Pulitzer Fiction Prize and the National Book Awards and several others. So they're not that excited about someone coming along and saying, we're going to pick the best of you. Whereas all the UK writers are kind of annoyed about it because that leaves no prizes that are just for the UK, except the Costa one, which is a bit erratic. So I was on the Booker long list once, and I had hoped to be on it again at some point. But now that I have to compete with Americans, I don't think I really have a chance again, which is quite sad.
One for AV, and this is about Granta. So when I read this, and this was the first time I had read Granta, I got the same feeling which you verbalized very well, saying that it's like a series or a compilation of short stories. So my question is, I mean, is it a faithful reproduction of an extract, or is it edited to achieve that end?
It is edited. It's so in the book, it's actually where there are breaks in the Granta extract. There'll be another chapter in between that in my book, which will take place in England in the sort of present day. So the Australian parts of my book, this is overcomplicated, but they run backwards. So they're Jake's most recent memories in Australia going back to her childhood. And then in between is present day on a small island. So it was quite a strange thing. I hadn't quite finished my book by the time I had to submit the extract. And and also you have to sort of take out bits here and there so that it will make sense, or more or less, as an extract. So yeah, it is a little bit different in the book.
There's another one question.
My questions are based on the extracts that I read from the Granta reader's book. First to the gentleman Ned about Glow. When I read it, I thought that it was a short story in itself. You know, there's a beginning and a end, and you know, it's the focus is on the value of real love. So I understood. But there is a lot of curiosity about what's going to happen further. Whether you are going to take it forward in the complexities of the relationships, or there is one of the characters is experimenting on something, or are you going to focus on that, on the complexities of the relationships?
Well, so when I was asked to submit something, I had a book to excerpt from, but I wanted to submit something that felt kind of self-contained and satisfying in its own right. And because the book is so plotty, there were no excerpts from the main part of the book that would make any sense because the plot builds up so fast. But there are these flashbacks which give the backgrounds of various of the characters before the main plot of the book starts. So I submitted one of the flashbacks, which is what you read in here. And it's so by the time you read that in the book, you've actually already met the character Win, and you already know what Glow is, and like the foxes have already come in, and so on. So in the context of the book, that extract, it's not the beginning of something. It's filling in it's answering a lot of questions that you have by the time you're about quarters of the way into the book. So that and the main character of the book is not Win. It's an English guy called Raf who lives in London, but he kind of collides with Win in the course of the plot. And so hopefully by the time you get to that part of the book, you're interested enough in Win to want to know what's happened to him. So you find out what happens to Win towards the end of the book. He has a kind of life afterwards, but he's not the focus of it.
Thank you.
You had another question for Evie as well?
Yes. I read the extract after the headland. And I must admit that I was intending to reread it to comprehend it even better. And what I understood was that the group is at Shearing Shed, and you have tried to portray their relationships. And in the end, there is a character called Beans. He loses his hand. And I guess after that, Claire gets dismissed from his job, and there's somebody else who is taken in. And is that so?
It's a kind of, yeah. It's a funny one because it's running backwards. So if you were to rejuggle it wherever it breaks, it would be Bean would lose his hand at the beginning, and then, at the end, she would punch the guy in the face and leave, and then she goes to England. So you've got the sense of it, but it is a complicated one to read an extract because it takes a while in the whole book to realise that this is what's happening.
I look forward to reading the entire book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We probably still have time to take two more questions, one to Ned, one to Evie. Ned, yours is from Shelja, and her question is the teleportation accident a satire on the present? And if yes, what does it say?
Yeah, it is to an extent. It's sort of ostensibly set, well, the first two chapters are ostensibly set in Berlin in the early 30s, but by the time I was writing it, I'd lost interest in trying to realistically depict a historical period that I didn't live through and basically know nothing about. So what I ended up writing about in practice was the period that I know, which is sort of East London in the 2010s. And while I was doing some scanty research on Weimar Berlin, I discovered that the two periods actually have an extraordinary amount alike, and the characters that you come across in the two of them are the same, and the parties are the same, and almost everything is the same apart from the surroundings. So it is kind of, I mean, it's not in a like a very gentle and limp way. It's a satire endorsed in 2010. If I'd wanted to go straight for the jugular, I could have probably done a slightly better job, but it still has to be to an extent in the service of this larger historical plot. But yeah, it is consciously more about the present really than it is about the 1930s.
And Evie, to you, Angelus has written that why are women relatively marginal in your novel After the Fire, and is it difficult to write in a male voice?
Well, I guess the only reason they're marginal in it is that the main characters are men. I feel like there are some quite strong female characters in there. It's just in the same way that All the Birds Singing has a female character, so the men are marginalised. It was just the voice that came out was male when I started writing, and I don't find it at all difficult. I think it seems to be something that people hold on to as being an unusual thing, a woman writing as a man, but I know some men, and it turns out they're people, and I find it sort of strange that would be picked apart from any other feat of imagination that a writer can do.
Yeah. We'll take one last question. This is from Ishwarya. She's got two, but we'll take only one. How, and either of you or both of you can actually answer this, how have your personal experiences affected your writing? How do you get started with writing and a story, and how do you conceive your best ideas? I think the second part we've answered, so maybe how have your personal experiences affected your writing? Or they haven't?
I mean, I guess for me anyway, it feels like personal experience and the experience of your parents and everything you watch on television and everything you hear on the radio and everything you read, it all goes in some way or another. Everything affects it, maybe not directly, but if there's something that affects the way you think, then it affects the way you write, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Ned?
Well, although the teleportation accident appears to be a sort of historical fantasia, it is perhaps to a surprising extent a diary of my life, the years 2009 to 2010, but cloaked in this sort of rather ragged postmodern historical knockabout storyline. So yeah, I mean, it's all in there, everything that happens to me. And my third one that's coming as well is very much like that. But I think after that I've run out of personal experiences, so I won't do that anymore.
You need to imagine them now, yeah. Okay, the idea was also to give out some of your books that we have here. We'll get you to sign them later on as well. But we need to also announce some of the winners who asked some interesting questions. Do you remember the questions that you really liked? Or should we just kind of take a call?
I like the question from that lady there.
Okay. So we, of course, give out one book to the Readers Club member in Delhi. Ned, do you want to pick on anything? Any particular question?
Oh, I don't know.
Did you like particularly that commenting on homosexuality, social awareness?
Oh, yeah, that was interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe Nithya gets the other one. And before we wrap up, just wanted to make sure we touched upon, you've been here for a week, or you will be here for a week at the translation school. You've got translators translating your short stories right in front of you. How's that experience? Of course, this is part of the literary translation workshop that we're doing together with Sahitya Academy, British Centre for Literary Translation, and British Council.
It's kind of like watching someone fixing your car, because they're doing it and you're like, it's my car, but I don't understand anything that's happening right now. I just have to trust that it will work out in the end because they're well-intentioned. And yeah, it seems like it's fun to see it discussed in such passionate terms, even though, yeah, I have no idea what's happening.
And this time round, you can't even drive it, can you?
No, exactly.
You don't understand the language at all.
No, yeah, then it gets given to someone else.
What about you, Evie?
It's been really interesting having to explain why you've used particular words, and quite difficult to explain. I use a lot of Australian dialect, so which makes very little sense in English. So that's been interesting.
Oh, Right. And so yes, I'm sure the audience should be looking forward to reading Ned and Evie's work in Punjabi and Assamese when it comes out, hopefully in 6 months' time. And you'll get a copy and you'll have nothing to understand what it's all about.
Perfect.
But what are your plans later on? I mean, after India, anything exciting coming up?
I'm going straight to Hong Kong
Oh.
for the festival, so that would be fun.
Yeah.
And then back to Peckham for Peckham Festival.
Oh, lovely. What about you, Ned?
I'm going straight to Kathmandu for the
Wow.
festival there, and then next month I'm doing Hey Dhaka, and I'm
Mm.
staying in Asia in between.
Oh, wow. That's lovely. So thank you for being with us, Evie, Ned. It's
Thank
been a
you.
real pleasure, and we hope to see you soon in India and the British Council. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.